US missiles fired by Ukraine kill sunbathers, including children, on a beach in Crimea. Moscow warns Washington it'll respond. Both sides are escalating weapons and targets in the Ukraine war. So, is there a greater danger of direct conflict between Russia and NATO? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidam. Furious reaction from Moscow to the latest attack by Ukraine on Russian-held Crimea. American-made ATACMS weapons fired by Ukrainian forces were intercepted by Russian defenses. But the debris killed civilians on a beach, including children. Russia summoned the US ambassador and is vowing to retaliate. Thousands of attacks have been carried out in more than 2 years of war between Ukraine and Russia. The consequences have been devastating for civilians all round. Both sides have been using the most advanced weaponry available in the war. So how has military technology evolved during the conflict? What's the risk of outright war between Russia and the West? We'll be discussing this with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Laura Khan.
A moment to grieve in Sevastopol, with flowers laid at a makeshift memorial for victims of a Ukrainian missile attack. This was the moment on Sunday when a trip to the beach for holidaymakers turned into a terrifying ordeal. Debris from high-precision guided missiles raining down on the sand in Crimea, scattering those who had come for fun and relaxation. And not all reached safety. Several people, including children, were killed and many others were wounded.
The tutor from our kindergarten has suffered. We were on the beach when all of this happened. It is an unbearable pain.
Moscow summoned the US ambassador over what it called a barbaric attack, saying it provided Ukraine the technology, guidance and training.
Ukraine launched 5 US-supplied ATACMS missiles armed with cluster munitions. All flight missions were introduced by the US experts based on the US satellite intelligence.
The US says it's no secret it provides the weapons, but it's up to Ukraine how it uses them.
We provide weapons to Ukraine so it can defend its sovereign territory against armed aggression. That includes in Crimea, which of course is part of Ukraine. And Russia could stop this war today.
The US began supplying Ukraine with short-range ATACMS missiles last year. 2 months ago, it started to supply longer-range versions, which can hit targets up to 300 kilometers. But analysts say the US is also supporting Russia in other ways.
Since the very start of this war, the United States and a number of allied countries have been saying that they will continue to supply military intelligence, photo reconnaissance, satellite imagery to the Ukrainian armed forces.
Russia is also relying more heavily on advanced weapons. Ukraine says Moscow has been using hypersonic missiles in major cities, including the capital, Kyiv. This includes the Zircon hypersonic missile, which experts say travels at 9 times the speed of sound and is nearly impossible to shoot down. President Vladimir Putin has disclosed Russian forces have used these and other hypersonic missiles against military infrastructure. Russia has declared it will retaliate against the Sevastopol beach attack, with the West handing Ukraine more advanced weapons and Moscow also admitting to using them. Many are concerned the war that's gone on for more than 2 years may now be entering a new and more dangerous phase. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Aljazeera.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. We have joining us from Ukraine in Odessa, Hannah Shelest. She's director of the Security Studies Program at Ukrainian PRISM. That's a foreign policy and security think tank. From Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, an independent Russian defense analyst. And in Bath, in the United Kingdom, Patrick Bury. He's a defense and security analyst at the University of Bath. and former British Army officer. Warm welcome to you all. If I could start with Hannah. How significant is it, Hannah, that we are now seeing Ukraine use longer-range ATACMS missiles in this war?
First of all, I would like to respond to some of the comments made in the initial video, because it's been quite a manipulation. We don't have the proof that the debriefs are from the Ukrainian shoot missiles. There are plenty of videos demonstrated in the Russian social networks that there have been Russian air defense that work inappropriately, not speaking that there were no air raids, so people were not even notified, considering that they're at the beach, which is just directly near the military base. And that's been very well known, and Crimean people are very annoyed now with the local authorities that they allowed such situation. And
Hannah, let me jump in there, though, and say we have seen comments from Ukrainian officials like advisor Mikhailo Podolyak calling civilians in this Crimea attack, quote, civilian occupiers. It does sound like the Ukrainians recognize that there were civilian casualties, if not a justification for it.
No, I don't know how you translate Mr. Podolyak. That's why I will not comment. But the Ukrainian statement's been very clear that Russia made Crimea militarized with the bases almost in each village and closed most of the beaches for the last 10 years. And that is the very well known, because they made all this notification. You can see the photos from Yevpatoria beach full of the shooting ranges and prepared stations. The radar system standing just on the beaches, they were presenting that Crimea is so much militarized. So de facto, if you are militarizing the recreational zones, you understand that you are bringing the military target just very close to the civilians. That's why that is quite a serious question, that if the missile is going against the military objects, in case your air defense is working inappropriately, that is the jeopardizing of the lives of the civilians. And definitely, unfortunately, we have the civilian casualties. But just a few weeks ago, we had absolutely the same situation in my city of Odessa, when the cluster munition missile from Russia also fall at the beach recreational area, with dozens of people killed and wounded. But nobody called it as the escalation or something like this. And if to return back about the longer, I would not say that suddenly we received something different from what we had, because Ukraine already for a year are using Storm Shadow missiles from the United Kingdom with 250 kilometers range. We used Neptune missiles against Crimea, that is Ukrainian made, with the 280 kilometers, and now even longer, the new modification that was used a few weeks ago against Novorossiysk. So the ATACMS, the previous modification we had was 160. And that was possible only for Crimea. Now we have a little bit of 300 kilometers. So you understand, from 250, 280, 300, it's not that much significant change to the...
Let me jump in and bring in Patrick. Moscow has a very clear line on this, saying the US was involved in the use of ATACMS, these ATACMS missiles, which were used in this attack. Patrick, my question is, does the use of these long-range ATACMS systems necessarily mean that there was a certain level of US involvement?
Hi, Sammy. I think, what this is, of course, given the nature of the conflict and the fact that Ukraine is reliant on predominantly Western, but not entirely Western or US aid, military aid, of course, there's some element there of involvement. That's just the way it goes. But as the secretary, the spokesman there, I think it was from the secretary, the Department of State said, they give Ukraine these weapons. It's up to Ukraine how the targets they choose. Of course, there's some intelligence and information support going on. There's clearly instructions about how to use the weapons. The actual interesting thing about this is, if this is, and again, like Hannah said, a question mark over number of casualties, exact nature of what happened. But let's just take the Russian explanation at face value for a moment and say that these cluster munitions were shot down. Well, the reason the US has been giving Ukraine the cluster version of the ATACMS is because they don't want to give them a high explosive variant, which is much more destructive and actually, depending on the target, much better at hitting hardened hardened targets, and single targets. So, like if you're just going for one air defense system rather than a load of aircraft on a runway, for example. And so, conversely, one of the actual things that may come out of this could be that the US decides that, we need to give them both kinds of missile, because hence an intercepted cluster munition won't cause the same sort of civilian casualties.
Pavel, is it really that significant, listening to what our panelists are saying? Is it really significant that Ukraine is using the long-range ATACMS in this conflict, given that it has other missiles which have even longer ranges? Or is it really, or is part of it at least, the target here, a Russian space tracking center? Does that increase Moscow's suspicions of US involvement?
Well, basically, the Russian line coming from the government, coming from President Vladimir Putin directly, is that this is an American war, that the Ukrainians are just proxies, that everything is decided in America, and that Russia is basically fighting America and its allies, and the allies are also kind of proxies, and it's all concentrating in Washington, D.C. That's an old kind of Soviet line on any kind of conflict of the Cold War, that you're dealing with the Americans directly, and that has been, well, it seems good from internal propaganda kind of outlook. For the third world, or the global south too, that Russia is not just fighting a smaller neighboring nation, but it's fighting the almighty United States that many don't like in the world. So it's a kind of win-win. And basically, many people believe in Moscow, that that's all the Americans, that they're running the show. So yes, that's how it is, and that's how it's going to be. It doesn't, since this apparently
Pavel,
was
perhaps
an American
what is new post the Soviet era is Moscow now talking about repercussions. What do you think the Kremlin is considering here?
Well, right now, I don't know what kind of repercussions. I mean, there's not that much Russia is going to do. It's not going to attack American servicemen or American territory on its own. I mean, we're not at that stage whatsoever. An intercept of an American drone over the Black Sea, well, maybe, if it's a drone. An intercept of an American spy plane or a British spy plane, that's a bit less likely. Then it could be sending, say, I don't know, missiles to North Korea, and saying that is a response for America sending missiles to Ukraine. Of course, that brings Russia into direct confrontation with South Korea, and that's also not a very good thing, since South Korea is a major world arms producer, and if they begin supplying Ukraine directly, that won't be good for Russia at all. But maybe that will be used to explain why Russia is going to kind of go and supply North Korea.
All right, Patrick, are we seeing a trend here of the more that time goes on, the more we're seeing more sophisticated weaponry deployed by both sides?
I think, yeah, as wars go on, it's basically you're in an innovation competition with your adversary, and you adapt or you die. And that just drives, we saw it in the Second World War, massive technological innovation. There's very potentially large things happening with digital information technologies at the moment in AI. We've seen the massive impact that drones are having on war. Recent reports suggesting that more soldiers are being killed now by drones than by artillery bombardments. That is, if that's proven to be correct, that's transformational.
So is Ukraine becoming something of a testing ground for weapons on both sides, Patrick?
I think, the testing ground thing, Sammy, it's a bit silly, isn't it? Is it a testing ground? Look, you want the best weapons if you're in a fight, yeah, don't you? And so, therefore, you want access to them. And of course, money, war is very expensive, and it drives into technological innovation. And when you've got the access to these platforms, you use them. The Zircon missile on Russia's side is, an example of this. Very difficult to shoot down and highly capable. Some of the other Russian pieces of kit, which have been deemed, almost wonder weapons, not proving to be like that at all. I think, on the other hand, these low-tech drones are having a massive impact. The low-tech glide bombs that Russia is using are actually having a very big impact, simply because they're cheap, and useful at destroying Ukraine's infrastructure, energy infrastructure. Conversely, some of the Ukrainian...
The moral of the story
drones,
there is new tech doesn't always need to be high tech. New tech can be low tech as well. Hannah, to what extent can new tech weapons fill the manpower vacuum, especially for Ukraine?
It's not only the man vacuum, but let's be honest, as Patrick said, that is the competition of innovations as well, because this war is asymmetric. And now producers of the weapons don't have 3-5 years to test something simple, because they know in case their weapons can prove it is efficient in the battlefield in Ukraine, they will have the orders, they will have the production, they can check is it working or not. That's why, for example, the UK producers are now giving almost anything Ukraine is asking exactly for testing it in the real conditions. None of the polygons can demonstrate you the results. As you can have in the real battlefield. And then it is the question of time, because when you introduce the new type of the technology, for example, the new drone, it is different frequency, different types of the interception. So you have, let's say, 1 month before your counterpart will understand how to intercept them. It means that this 1 month you have the advantage compared to another side. Then definitely another side can crack, for example, them, and you need to search for something new. But that is now more of the general. It's not just the manpower. It's also the question of the producers. Some are just giving the old storages because it is working good. So why not? It should be just used, and on the ground you have the storages. It's cheaper than demolishing. But others understand that in the beginning of the war, especially with the drones, there were plenty of cases when foreign countries were delivering to Ukraine something extremely sophisticated, but it appeared absolutely ineffective at the battlefield. So the producers needed to sit and to think from the scratch what to do, why it was wrong. And now each of these producers can come either to work together with Ukrainian military or to test or to propose, because other countries, when they're now coming at the defense fairs around the world, one of the first questions they are asking, have you checked it in Ukraine, or have you tried it in the real battlefield conditions? Otherwise, it is like nice for the museum or for your advertisement, but it is bad for your defense.
Pavel, along with a shift in weaponry, are we seeing perhaps a shift in targets, in tactics? On the one hand, Ukraine hitting deeper into Russian territory in recent weeks, the Russians increasing their focus in their attacks on Ukraine's energy sector.
Well, Russia's been hitting Ukraine energy sector already for 2 years.
But there's been an increase recently, though, wasn't there?
Yes, there has been. They're trying to knock it out. There is success there, yes, but Ukraine is still functioning not only as a state, but also its defense industry is also still working. Actually, most of the drones that are used on the battlefield, and which are specific, very specific for this conflict and the novelty, the mass use of cheap drones, Ukraine is producing itself right now. And that's a big change, of course, in the battlefield. Ukraine has also right now acquired what Russia had from the very beginning, the capability to hit deep into Russian territory, also mostly using self-made, rather primitive drones, but still they managed to hit precisely more than 2,000 kilometers deep into Russia. And that was not with American technology per se, though there is, of course, American involvement in, say, the guidance system. Apparently, they're working through some kind of satellites, so they're most likely, I would believe, commercial than military use. But it also should be noted that this is a very specific war. It's a war in itself, and actually, a lot of the tech used there is not very new at all. Ukraine will be getting F-16 fighters because the European nations are scrapping them. They're replacing them with new American F-35 stealth fighters, and those they don't need, they're handing over to Ukraine. The attack MS missiles are also America's replacing now. So Ukraine is getting weapons that are several, maybe decades old, and they're not really the cutting edge. So I wouldn't say that this war is going to reflect on future wars. Kind of the future wars will be the same. Most likely they won't.
Right.
But a lot of things that are happening there are very important for everyone, every military in the world.
Okay, let me bring Patrick in, and can we look at the target of the latest attack in Crimea, a space tracking center, as part of a pattern of escalating targets and tactics here? I mean, that serves US and Western interests beyond just the conflict in Ukraine, is the suggestion we're hearing.
I think the conflict, wars tend to pull to the extremes, as Karl von Clausewitz, the theorist, said. And the longer they go on, the longer they pull to the extremes. And so I think we're starting to see increased vertical escalation. Horizontal escalation rather than vertical escalation. So it's moving across. I think, and this example is potentially an indicator of that the conflict is spreading horizontally. I don't read into it much more than that, though. And I think that horizontal escalation is happening on both sides. And it's spreading, and we've seen it as a result, resulting in increasing cooperation with Russia and Iran, Russia and North Korea, and to a lesser extent, but also important, China. And we're seeing it horizontally escalate in terms of the Ukraine, as Pavel just rightly said, the development of their own indigenous deep strike capability against Russian refineries. And that horizontal escalation is worrying, but hopefully it can be contained. That's how I'm more viewing it as a sort of natural progression.
Hannah, how worrying is it? I mean, in the sense that the more that the targets and the weaponry escalate, the more that Russia will escalate its weaponry and targets. Is there a concern in Ukraine about whether Ukraine can really keep up in this game?
Can I answer by questions? Do you think that the escalation is still not at the toppest level? If you follow the number of the air raids and the air attacks that Ukraine has per day, and the number of the targets and destroyed civilian infrastructure per day, we are not speaking about per month, I don't know what is more escalation. Look at the situation in Kharkiv, the second biggest city.
Well, I think the big concern, Hannah, would it not be nuclear weapons ultimately?
For nuclear weapons became that dragon monster from the cartoons, and Russians really understood that is the topic that a lot of countries, especially those who don't have the nuclear weapons, are predominantly afraid, because nobody used it after the Second World War and nobody knows what are the results. But let's be critical thinking. If Russia will use, doesn't matter, tactical, because strategic it's against the US, but tactical nuclear weapons, first of all, that means that Russia totally lost with the conventional weapons, because they understand that when they use the nuclear tactical weapons, they will lose even Chinese support. China can allow this war because of their anti-American moods, or because they don't want the stronger one of the parts. China can involve because of economic interest or selling any of the spare parts. But nuclear issue is very crucial for China. And without Chinese support, for Russia, it will be very difficult at the international arena. Previous times when Russian nuclear rhetoric went high, that was exactly Beijing with all his difficulties in position regarding this war. But in nuclear, they were very strong and strict for Moscow. Don't use it and don't overuse the rhetoric. Otherwise, North Korea, otherwise Iran and others would use it as well.
Pavel, are we witnessing, I think this may be what Patrick was referring to when he talked about how the conflict is spreading horizontally. Are we witnessing perhaps new strategies, new approaches emerging in recent weeks? You know, Russia sending warships to Cuba, signing an alliance agreement with North Korea, or just not too long ago, we had the French president indicating the dispatch of Western troops to Ukraine, well, couldn't be ruled out, is I think the way he put it.
Oh, yes, there is an escalation. There's an escalation in wording. Russia has begun using very extensively the brinkmanship, the balancing on the brink of a nuclear conflict, talking a lot about that. Such tactics developed in the 50s first by the Americans. The term brinkmanship was coined by John Foster Dulles then. It's a legitimate tactic, but its results are always limited. Russia used it before. Mostly it was coming from former President Dmitry Medvedev. That didn't work at all. Now it's Putin talking about that, hinting that this is possible, talk about changing the Russian nuclear doctrine. But of course, doctrines in Russia, well, they are not really used when they're making the real decisions. And actually moving from threats to going over the nuclear threshold into nuclear usage, well, that's an enormous step. And I don't think that we are right now there at all. Right. So now it's going to continue as it is, I would say.
All right, I think we've got a minute left. I'm going to try and bring Patrick in very briefly. So how seriously should we take whether it's Russian statements in the parliament about altering the nuclear doctrine protocols, or what the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov just said after this attack about, well, he referred to the Russian president's earlier comments this month about arming countries to strike Western countries?
Yeah, the idea of sort of extending again horizontally the conflict, that's more likely than the nuclear thing at the moment, of course. I agree with Pavel there. I think we're thankfully a good bit away from there. Luckily, there's better minds than me and better systems that we have at our disposal looking at Russian nuclear force readiness. And really, ultimately, and the Russians know this and everyone else knows it, it is the readiness of those forces and the steps that they go through which tell us whether we are close to a serious escalation or not. And luckily, we, as far as I'm understand, we've never got really beyond sort of 2/3 of the way to that, of the use of strategic nuclear forces in this conflict and the processes with which they would go through. So that's what you look for. Don't listen to what people are saying. Unfortunately, you just look at what's ready.
And hopefully what we look at, let's hope the picture gets better for people, and especially civilians, on all of that region. Let's thank our guests right now, Hannah Shellest, Patrick Bury and Pavel Felgenhauer. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.